The talk that I want to give this morning is really about how critical realism can help us address and hopefully overcome and move beyond some very contemporary quagmires in contemporary feminist theory and theorizing. Um, in particular, I'm thinking of the huge rift that's opened up between kind of a radical feminism and a trans-aware feminism, a trans positive feminism, and the seemingly impossible impasse that has emerged between them. I do think there are ways that we can overcome them through using critical realism. And because my talk is intersectional, I will also dwell for some time on the relevance of race. I'm going to try to share my slides, if that is possible. Let's see if I can get this happening. So, this is the introduction slide, so we're going back a little bit. First, I think we should start off with some definitions. What is it that we mean by sex and gender? Well, there is a long history of feminist theorizing, identifying sex, that is the dimorphic sexual split between male and female that is quite common throughout humanity as a central organizing structure of society. This sexual difference has been the foundation of human social and economic structures that have been built on its back, such as the division of labor and the roles and responsibilities surrounding the production and reproduction of society. However, under a patriarchal system, we know that women have been systemically subordinated in order to maintain these structures. The notion of gender, which is the more common term that we use these days to talk about sexual difference, really, was introduced when feminist theorizing came in to critique femininity and to split the notion of the biological from this artificial or the social that was layered on top of the dimorphic sexual difference. And feminist theorists now tend to see gender as a socio-cultural aspect of identity, and it's more related to identification with and performance of some kind of behaviors and practices that tend to be seen on a spectrum between masculinity and femininity. But in general, feminists tend to agree that gender is used primarily as a valuing and a disciplining force. But because I think of some taboos around the word sex, we don't tend to use sex very much anymore, except maybe on some official forms and identification. So a brief CR take on sex and gender. We have to, because we are critical of this, we have to take account of the body. There is human sexual dimorphism, and the observation of exceptions to this, such as intersex people, does not suggest that there are no basic structures and or kinds, that is male and female. Lena Gunnarsson and Carolyn New have some great work showing us and illustrating the ways in which sex is ontologically prior to gender, in the same way that culture is emergent from nature. So taking a CR take on a layered reality, a depth ontology, and an emergent reality allows us to kind of analytically separate those different layers. And building on this, we then can see that gender operates predominantly at higher order levels beyond the biological. And as such, it's not binary in the same way that sex is binary. It's multifaceted, it's fluid and dynamic, and it is argued here to be emergent from sex. And then in a forthcoming paper, I'm looking at using affordance theory to talk about how the human body is eminently genderable because of the dimorphic sexual difference. And those processes of gendering, which occur across different societies throughout historical time periods, tend to offer a cascade of socially endorsed action potentials or affordances, as well as constraints that tend to be, policed and norms which tend to be kind of guarded very seriously. Moving on to the subject of race, I think there are similarities and differences. The similarities with gender are that race is a discursive category. It has sociocultural rather than biological roots, separating humans on the basis of kind of appeared or very loosely, phenotypical characteristics. But the important thing for us to remember about race is that it is historically emergent, and the definitions of race came along with processes of European colonization, indigenous genocide, and African enslavement. And today we tend to use this, again, kind of a conflation of race and ethnicity, but they're related, but not equivalent. Discrimination on ethnic grounds may be called racism in some places. Racial and ethnic minorities may experience some commonalities of experience. Racialized phenotypical characteristics are not the same as ethnic cultural markers of heritage and systems of belief and the things that come along with culture and ethnicity. But like gender, race is also used as a valuing and disciplining force. And that it's just important to get to the bottom of the fact that it like gender, has, very tenuous links with biology. It's emergent from assumed biological differences that in contemporary science have been shown to not exist. There's actually more difference within so-called racial groupings than there is between races, and they're so in terms of intersectionality, that's bringing these two things together, as well as other categories. Black feminism in the US context stressed that sex and gender is not enough. We have to take it in conjunction with both race and class, and we have the formation in the late 80s and early 90s of intersectionality theory, which had been present in Black feminist thought for years and years before that, centuries before that, but was named in the late 20th century. And this has become a very effective argument against single axis and exclusionary essentialist thinking. But the way the intersectional feminism has evolved today is highly influenced by post-structuralism and radical feminism. So whereas it kind of emerged out of a more structuralist ontology, it has become very post-structuralist. And so it is super wary of biological claims. If you were to speak to most intersectional feminists who do not take into account the ways in which they have been influenced by post-structuralism, they'll say things like, oh, well, there's nothing, gender has nothing to do with the body. And they don't see that it has been emergent and is still tied in many ways to our unexplored assumptions about the continued relevance of dimorphic sexual difference. But why do we need to pay attention to intersectional feminism? I mean, so many reasons. It has been one of the most significant contributions of Black feminism to feminist theory, and to feminist theory to other social science. But very importantly, contemporary Black and post-colonial feminists are at the forefront of really key activism regarding racial and economic justice, the climate crisis, the migrant crisis, and I mean, taking an intersectional feminist perspective has really become, the hallmark of, being aware and being put in. We're facing so many huge social issues that sometimes it feels like we're fighting on all fronts. We're seeing a rise in explicit racial violence, a re-rise of white supremacy, anti-migrant sentiment, far-right and fascist ideologies, and at the same time, a persistence, it's never gone away, of gender-based inequality, violence-based patriarchy, misogyny, toxic masculinity. These names are kind of emergent from contemporary feminist discourse. And these, of course, intersect with key structural oppressions such as racial capitalism and neocolonialism. And what that leaves are so many marginalized and vulnerable communities at particular points of intersection. Global migrant and refugee crises affect men and women in particular ways, trans folks and gender nonconforming folks in particular ways. We see that queer youth are most likely to be homeless for all of these various intersecting issues of oppression that they're facing. Trans misogyny leaves trans women of color at very high risks of violence. And then while this is going on, intersectional language has been co-opted by mainstream white liberal and radical radical feminism, but not actually put into practice. Those are some of the key issues that we see happening. I notice that I'm probably running short on time, so I just want to take it to this slide, and then I'll end it here. We know that intersectional feminism and radical feminism are stuck in a place where they can't seem to talk to each other, because radical feminism is super based in dimorphic sexual difference and very invested in articulating, that there's fundamental differences between men and women, whereas kind of more contemporary trans-positive feminism seemingly wants to do away with the relevance of the body. Well, critical realism can help us because it sits right there in the middle, allows us to account for the relevance of the body plus the relevance of the social through its theorization on emergence. It reminds us of the relationships of natural necessity that we have to pay attention to, but also allows us to take into account that there is a process of structure and agency where individuals do reflexively make decisions about how they wish to live, how they wish to present themselves. And we can use the tools from the critical realist toolbox to help us understand people's subjective practices and subjective behaviors, as well as considering how we might structure society so that it is in general less oppressive, less violent, and less harmful to folks who are struggling at neglected points of intersection. Now I'll stop there.
Great. Angela, do you want to come in there on in relation to that issue of sort of perceptions and how people...
I absolutely do. And it just strikes me as so important for thinkers to grapple with that issue, Chris, of the fact that, while the assumption that everybody's at the lower left-hand side of the bell curve is a problem, it's also a problem that people see one or two or just a small number of exceptions and then assume that the issue does not exist. And for me, that taps into the notion of being post-race. And the US context, people said, oh, well, Obama was president, we had a Black president, we must be post-race. And the critical realist tool that comes to mind for me is remembering transfactuality, right? Things do not always operate in the way that, or the powers do not always operate in the way that we expect them to. They are, it's a complex system, it's an open system, because there are some instances of certain things happening doesn't mean that there are not other forces at play. So I think it's really important to kind of have a critical view on, social trends and patterns of performance. In organizational studies, you might have an organization that says, because we have a woman or a person of color that's made it to top level management, we don't have issues of bias within our organization, but they're not looking at the deeper levels of patterns. And they see these exceptions and they say, well, there is no structural issue, but it's something really to look more closely at.
Great, thank you. For all of you, I just wondered if we could step back just a moment and if I could ask you, how did you find yourself going to critical realism in the first place? If you can give us some thoughts on that, because I know that for many people, they don't even get to critical realism, and if they do, it's kind of through circuitous routes. I'm just wondering how you yourselves found your way to critical realism in the first place.
I also encountered critical realism during my PhD, thanks to one of my supervisors, Dr. Lee Martin, and I only realized how socialized I had been into post-structuralism in my undergraduate degree when I started to take a critical realist perspective and understand how post-structuralism had a kind of hegemony in the Asian American studies, ethnic studies work that I had done in undergraduate. I really feel like one of the things that I'm not sure if I should say that critical realism should, as it's not necessarily an entity itself, that critical realist thinkers could possibly do more of, is emphasizing the ways in which positivism and post-structuralism have contributed to the outcomes that we have today, have made different kinds of science possible, and how critical realism is really building on a lot of their strengths, as well as addressing some of their shortcomings. And it's a very much of a peacemaker approach, but I think that there's a lot of value in emphasizing it's not that we are completely against these other positions, but that we recognize their strengths, and yet there are gaps. And what is the goal of science in general? It's to build on previous knowledge and to address gaps, and to take us forward in our thinking. And so I found that that approach can be helpful, but that is assuming that the folks that you're speaking to even have the awareness that they are embedded in usually one or the other ideology.